Now, I doubt that anyone here has ever seen a leper, because the disease in our generation has been almost extinguished. There are still lepers. There's not many. It's not widespread. Highly contagious. So the quarantine was imposed in Bible days. People were removed from society for the rest of their life unless by some miracle the leprosy would leave their body. Leprosy in India is still somewhat prevalent with that multitude of people on such a small peninsula. And there it often finds its manifestation not by an outward boil, but by a numbness. It begins in the hands, sometimes parts of the face, nose, ear, may become insensitive. And from there, the body, the condition worsens and the body deteriorates. And so likely these men bore in their bodies the outward boils of this leprosy that had eaten away at features of their face or their hands or often their feet. And as they made their way to the priest, they looked and they saw that the leprosy was gone. The boils were gone. The outward soil, the outward boils, the oozing, the nasty destruction and corruption of their flesh had dried up. And they began to rejoice. But one of the 10, who happened to be not a Jew, but a Samaritan, one of the 10 became so thankful about the healing that he had just experienced. His life at that moment been changed forever. And he turned back and he found Jesus. He had not even been to the priest yet, but he thanked him, gave him thanks for the miracle that had taken place in his body. Jesus said, weren't there 10 men? Weren't there 10 men who were cleansed? So how come there's only one, this Samaritan, that has returned to give thanks to God? So anyway, this is a wonderful story, and a lot has been said about it. So perhaps you've heard a lot of messages on the 10 lepers. Today I'm going to talk to you about the 3 lepers. Not the 10, just the 3. The story that I just related to you is in the 17th chapter of Luke, begins with verse 11 through 19. But I want to talk to you first about a leper whose name perhaps you're familiar with. This man was first mentioned in the 2nd book of Kings, the Old Testament, chapter number 5, 5th chapter of 2nd Kings. His name is Naaman, but he's mentioned again in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And that's, I guess, when I became intrigued, studying leprosy there in the book of Luke. I came across, really surprisingly, a reference to this Old Testament character, Naaman. Now, Naaman was not a Jew either. Wasn't of the descendants of Abraham. He actually was a general in the army of the Syrians. They had overtaken a part of Israel and had taken a number of the Israelis captive back into Syria as slaves. He was the general of this army, but he had contracted leprosy. He's the first leper we're going to talk about today. The book of Luke mentions him. Jesus is speaking and says, there were a lot of lepers in the land of Israel, but only Naaman was healed in that generation. Now consider what he just said. Naaman wasn't a descendant of Abraham. The promises of healing that had come to them, putting on them none of the diseases that had been upon the Egyptians, he had not received that promise as a descendant of Abraham, yet where the others, the men of Israel, had died as lepers, this stranger from Syria was healed. So I think we ought to look at his story. He had actually, one of the girls, the little maidens that had been taken captive from Israel back into the land of Syria, had become his household servant. I don't know what got into this girl's heart, but for some reason, over the course of time that she had served as a slave in Naaman's house, waited on his wife, she began to care about Naaman to the point that she cared about his sickness and his leprosy. And the Bible tells us that she began to pray that God would heal the man that had taken her captive into a foreign land of leprosy. And so one day, she said to Naaman's wife, I just wish that some way that there was a prophet in the land of Syria, the way there's a prophet in the land of Israel. Said, if the man of God, Elisha, lived in Syria, he would come and heal Naaman of his leprosy. And so Naaman's wife thought about that, told Naaman about that. This may not seem like something he'd think about, that God was a healer or that he could be healed, but now he's desperate. He's got leprosy. There's no cure for him. He's just going to get worse from now to the day that he dies. So he goes to the king of Syria and tells him what the girl has said. King of Syria sends a message to the king of Israel and says, I want to send my general Naaman down to you so that you can cure him of leprosy. And I'm sure the king of Israel took that in a bad way. Why would I want to cure the general of his leprosy? And besides that, he thought that the king of Syria was just setting a trap for him, looking for a reason to come back and put more oppression against him, because there was no way that he could cure this man. And so while the king is worried about this, the Lord speaks to Elisha. And Elisha sends a message to the king and says, don't let your heart be troubled by this. Just send the man to me. And so, now, I know you're familiar with this story, so just bear with me when I tell you how Naaman went to the house of the prophet. And when he called at the door, there was a man by the name of Gehazi, the servant of the prophet, that came and opened the door. And the first one to see the general at the prophet's house was this servant Gehazi. And he looked at him and no doubt was smitten with the terror of this dread disease, perhaps understand that it was across the forehead of Naaman. And so while he left the general, because he don't bring him into the house, he's a leper. He left the general at the door. He went back to tell the man of God that the general from the armies of Syria is waiting at the door. But the prophet doesn't go to see him. He says, you go tell the man to go to the river Jordan and to dip himself 7 times under the water, and if he'll do that, he'll be made clean. And so the prophet sent his servant Gehazi comes back and says to Naaman, the prophet says, you go to the river Jordan, dip yourself 7 times into the Jordan, and when you have dipped 7 times, you'll be cleansed from your leprosy. He closed the door in his face. That was it. And the general was so insulted, the man of God had never even come and looked at him face to face. He didn't invite him into his home. He could understand that because he was a leper. But the idea that this lowly man of Israel would refuse to even come and meet him, greet him in person, but sends a servant with an order for him to go dip 7 times in the Jordan River. Hey, let me ask you a question. Side issue. How many of you ever heard about muddy Jordan? You ever hear that? That's not true. Everybody's always talking about muddy Jordan, but the reason they say that the Jordan River's muddy is because of what Naaman said. Naaman said, there's waters in my home that are better than this old Jordan River. And so if I'd wanted to bathe, I could have bathed in one of those. It would have been better than come here to this old dirty Jordan River, muddy river. He was just speaking disparagingly of the river Jordan, but the river Jordan is not a muddy river. It runs clean. runs pure. They even today do not even treat that water. It runs into the Sea of Galilee, and the water pulled out of the Sea of Galilee is used in the water systems of the modern cities there now. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with the Jordan River except Naaman's heart. Naaman said, I could have been cleansed in my homeland. There's a lot of clean rivers there. And I don't want to come down to this muddy Jordan River. And so he said, I'm not going to do it. Let's go home. He had a servant that said, General, there's no one down here. I mean, no one will know. No one in our homeland will know if you dip in that water or not. I mean, I know that kind of seems silly to dip in the water, but if this is as big a farce as you think it is, you go dip in the water and come out and no one will ever know it. But if this man has really heard from God, this might change your life. It'd be worth a try. We're here. We've already come. You just as well try. So Naaman agreed. Naaman went to the Jordan River and he dipped himself 7 times. He did not get gradually better with each dip. After 6 times, he looked exactly like he looked, except he was wet. But he just, I'm here 6 times, I might as well. And he dipped the 7th time, and when he came up out of the water, the skin that had been eaten by the leprosy looked as tender and soft and whole as a baby's skin. He was completely well. He was completely well. Now, what do you suppose he did? When he was well, Israel had been despised in his eyes. The river Jordan was despised. The prophet was despised in his eyes. But that was before he was healed. That was when he was still a leper. That was when he was dying a little bit every day. He comes up out of the water and he goes back to the house of the prophet. And he revealed something that we didn't know before. When he made this journey from the beginning, in case he got help, in case he was made well, wasn't really sure if he would or not, but in case he did, he had loaded his chariot up with many changes of clothing and silver and gold that he would reward the prophet with if he made him whole. And since he was well, he came to the prophet and said, here it is. I want to give you this gift because you have prayed to God and he's made me clean of the leprosy. Now that was gratitude. But the prophet wouldn't accept it. So the prophet would not accept it, which leads us to the second leper. When Naaman was rejected, he said, I'm going to have this one, talk to the prophet, said, I've got to have this one issue. Said, I'm going to serve the Lord God the rest of my life, with one exception. My king insists that I stand once a year in worship to the false gods. I won't worship that God, but I will be at that service once a year. Other than that, the rest of my life, I'm going to serve God. He's proven himself to be greater than any God in the whole world. He got in his chariot and he started home. When Gehazi shows up, says to the prophet, where's Naaman going? The prophet told him. And Gehazi thought, no, this isn't right. For this man to come here from a foreign country, he's already oppressed our country. He's already taken a number of our people captive. Now he comes and he's healed of leprosy and he gets away scot-free. Doesn't cost him a thing. So he runs and overtakes the chariot of Naaman and said, hey, my master just sent me because some of the sons of the prophet some of the students are in the Bible school, in other words, need clothes and need some money. Not all that you were planning, but just a little bit. And so Naaman was just overjoyed to do it. And he gave Gehazi these clothes and money. And Gehazi took them and hid them. And after they're hid, he come back home. Here are some of my favorite words in the whole Old Testament King James Version. Why? Because they're so funny. I mean, strange, funny. When he comes back to the prophet, Elisha says to Gehazi, are you ready for this? Well, the prophet says, where did you go? But Gehazi answered, thy servant wentest out no whither. Now, what does that mean? Thy servant wentest out no whither. That's why they don't. Wait. I was just going to explain to you, if you want to know why you see all these other modern translations, is because the King James Version has stuff in it like, thy servant wentest out no whither. People don't talk that way anymore. In other words, I didn't go anywhere. Sounded just like a teenager. When their mother told them to come home at 10 o'clock and they got home at 10:30, where you been? I haven't been anywhere. And the prophet said, didn't my heart go with you when the man turned back to you out of his chariot and he gave you that gold, gave those changes of clothing? And I said, because of what you've done, the leprosy of Naaman will be upon you and your children for the rest of your life. And that moment, leprosy broke out across the forehead of Gehazi. That's the second leper. How am I doing time-wise? Going to keep an eye on this. These stories can get long. I got to move ahead. So that was the 5th chapter of the book of 2 Kings. Let me move ahead to the 7th chapter of the book of 2 Kings. Now, you're not going to find anybody's name in here that you recognize until later. I'm going to show you this because we have some lepers that are in this story, but none of their names are named. Just some lepers. What has happened is this war between Syria and Israel has continued, despite the fact that the general of the Syrian army had been so blessed by the God of Israel. The war continued to wage for years, and the Syrian army had laid a siege against the city of Samaria, which was the capital of Israel. And they wouldn't let anybody go in and nobody come out. And so after about a year, all the food was gone. They had very little water and no food, and they were selling a donkey's head for about how much money you'd make in a year's salary. Because food, and I wouldn't even call that food, but that was what it was. And it was desperate. And so as the people inside the city were starving, siege laid against them, there were in the gate lepers. And the lepers sat there and they were starving, but they had been starving anyway because they were lepers. And so here they said among themselves, what are we going to do here? And we're sitting here, this siege has been against the city. If we go into the city, those people are going to kill us. We know that they will kill lepers if we go into the town. If we go out to the army of Syria, they may kill us. Or they may not kill us. Now, if we stay here, we're going to die. If we go into the city, we are certainly going to die. But if we go to the camp, we might find some crumbs. We might find some leftovers. Or we may live. The only way we could possibly live is to go out to the Syrian army. Now, they may kill us, but we're going to die if we stay here. We're going to die if we go in the city. So let's go to see what happens. They didn't know that God had a plan, but God had a plan. And as they're walking up the road that leads to the Syrian camp, the Syrians hear them coming. But it doesn't sound like 7 lepers walking up the road. It sounds like 700,000 armies with chariots coming up the road. God has amplified the sound of these lepers coming up So bad, so much that the Syrian army was terrified. They were so terrified they didn't take down a tent, they didn't load up an animal, they just fled, ran as hard as they could go to get out of harm's way. They thought that Israel had hired some mercenaries against them and that they were going to be destroyed. And so they evacuated the camp. So when the lepers come into the camp expecting to be faced with spears and be arrested, instead they find an empty camp. And they go to the first tent and open it, and it's full of stuff. It's full of wealth. It's full of food. It's full of clothing. It's loaded with stuff. And so they eat all they can hold, and then they think, let's carry this away. So they carry it away and go hide it somewhere. And they come back and get another tent. About the third tent, they get to thinking and said, this isn't good. We've got a whole city down here, Samaria, is starving to death. And if we keep all this to ourselves and don't tell them, God's wrath's going to fall on us. And so they went down to the city, and there they shared with those people the wealth that was in that camp. That day, from that terribly impoverished situation, the city went until you could just buy food for nothing. They couldn't get enough money to buy food. Before there wasn't any food to buy. Now there's so much food that for just a few pennies they can buy more than what they can eat for a month. I mean, it has completely changed because these lepers got to thinking out of gratitude, we should share this blessing with the people of Samaria. And they blessed them. They knew that they would have killed them, but instead they blessed them, and the Samaritans, the city, the Samaritans, the city was delivered, and the people saved. Now I want to talk about the 8th chapter of 2 Kings. And here in the 8th chapter of 2 Kings, the king of Israel is talking to guess who? He's speaking to Gehazi. Now, by this time in history, the prophet Elisha has already died and gone to heaven. And the king is talking to Gehazi about all the miracles that God had done through Elisha. In fact, we know that there were 33 miracles that were recorded during his lifetime, plus a 4th miracle when a dead man was raised after he was dead. The 34th miracle was performed. So among those miracles that he was talking about, you remember the story of the Shunammite woman who the prophet prayed for, and God gave her a son. Then the son died, and then the prophet Elisha raised him from the dead. And he's telling that story to the king. And as he's telling that story to the king, at that moment, the Shunammite woman and her son, who have gone into a far country to escape a plague, have come back, and now they're asking the king, she wants her land back. And when she comes to ask for her land back, at that very moment, there's Gehazi talking to the king, telling him about this woman and her son that God raised from the dead. And there he is, the man that God raised from the dead. A man by the name of Habakkuk. You'll hear about him later. Not today, but another day. And now, here's the problem. What was this leper, Gehazi, doing in the palace of the king? What was this leper doing talking to the king? Now, there can only be one answer to that question. Only one. He was not a leper anymore. Now, God had said through the prophet, you have leprosy, you're going to have leprosy until you die. But 3 chapters later, he can't be in the palace if he's a leper. He can't even be in town. He can't be talking to the king if he's a leper. He's talking to the leper, telling the story about the Shunammite woman and her son, telling it to the king. has an audience with the king, I'm here to tell you, something happened to the prophet, or to the leper, between chapter 5 and chapter 8. And I believe that what happened to him was in chapter 7, when he was one of those 7 lepers that said, if we keep this to ourselves, it would be wrong. God's going to judge us if we keep this to ourselves. But if we share it with the city, it's going to save the city. That was the second leper. The third leper was one man that we heard about at the beginning of this message. This was the leper who was a Samaritan, a foreigner. And he was so thankful that Jesus had cleansed his leprosy, that while the others went to show themselves to the priest and to offer their sacrifice and to go home and go back to a normal life and go back to a normal routine and live with their wife and live with their children and grow old in a normal way, this man said, I can't do that. First, I've got to go back and I've got to give thanks to Jesus. Because leprosy was eating away at my body. Leprosy had separated me from my home. Leprosy had taken me away from my life, and I was simply a dead man waiting for the occasion to be buried until Jesus cleansed me of my leprosy. And he said, before I can go on to the priest and offer my sacrifice and return to my home and to hold my children in my arms again and eat normal food and live a normal life, before I can do that, I've got to go back and give thanks to the one that took leprosy out of my body. The sores are gone. The sickness is gone. Hopelessness is gone. And he came back to Jesus and gave thanks. And Jesus said to him, there were 10 that were healed. Only this one Samaritan has come to give thanks. He said, your faith has made you whole. I don't know how many times God has done this. I know of one time that he did this in modern time. A leprous girl in the islands of the Pacific had lost the fingers off her hands and the toes off her feet. When the Lord touched her and not only cleansed her of the leprosy, but recreated fingers on her hands and toes on her feet, he not only cleansed her, but he made her whole. And this third leper from the story of the Gospel of Luke, when the Lord spoke the word, the leprosy lost its power. The disease left his body. But when he came back to give thanks, he was restored. And Jesus made him whole. So what I want us to do today, before we leave here this morning, season of Thanksgiving, I want everybody to have the opportunity to do what this third leper did. That he's taken the sin out of your life. That he's changed you from certain spiritual death, damnation, and given you a new life and new hope. That's a wonderful thing. That's the word of Jesus. That's what he's spoken to your life. But we're going today to give you an opportunity, as the Samaritan did, just to return back to Jesus this morning and give him thanks. And we believe it. As you give him thanks, your faith makes you whole. He will not only have you cleansed from the leprosy, but he's going to restore everything that the power of sin has taken away from you.